If you've had COVID, did you think that the virus affected your memory or ability to think straight? Maybe you described it as brain fog. Well, new research published in the last half hour or so in the New England Journal of Medicine reports that having COVID could lead to a modest cognitive decline, commensurate, the research says, with a 3-point loss in IQ, rising to a 9-point loss in IQ if you ended up in intensive care. We'll talk to the author of the study in a moment, as well as a woman living with the long-term effects of COVID. First, here's Kate.
Could you remember the shapes you've just seen? This is just one test used to research the so-called brain fog associated with COVID-19. From the early stages of the pandemic, some COVID patients described being left with long-term changes to how they think, concentrate and remember. But objectively measuring those changes has proved tricky. One large study has attempted to shed light on the issue by assessing the cognitive function of more than 100,000 adults in England. Participants completed an online assessment in 2022. This is one of the 8 tests they did, measuring verbal reasoning. Other tests looked at things like spatial planning or memory recall. And putting all that together, researchers calculated a global cognitive score. That data showed that compared to participants who'd never contracted COVID-19, those who'd recovered from the virus in up to 12 weeks saw a small cognitive deficit. Researchers suggest this is broadly equivalent to a gap of 3 IQ points. Patients whose symptoms had not resolved after 12 weeks, some of whom may be diagnosed with long COVID, saw a greater cognitive deficit. Comparing different groups, scientists also concluded those infected in the early stages of the pandemic, when the original strain or alpha variant of the virus were dominant, were more greatly impacted, as well as those hospitalised by COVID-19. Compared to those who didn't contract COVID, patients who needed to be admitted to intensive care performed on average an equivalent of 9 IQ points worse. Now, COVID is far from the only virus which can affect cognitive function. It's long been known that severe viral illnesses which result in brain inflammation or encephalitis can impair the way patients think. Long-term cognitive impairment can even be seen after severe cases of flu, when patients develop acute respiratory distress syndrome. In this case, we have to remember there are some limitations to these findings. Those who reported having brain fog were more likely to sign up to complete the assessment in the first place, for example. And we don't yet know whether these gaps in cognitive performance will resolve themselves over time. But those experiencing the long-term effects of COVID would hope this research is just the beginning. A greater understanding of exactly how COVID affects our brains and learning to treat it is also essential.
Well, let's talk now to Dr. Adam Hampshire, who is cognitive neuroscientist at Imperial College London, who worked on the study. And Dr. Joanna Herman is here, an infectious diseases consultant who has long COVID. Welcome both of you. Thank you for being on the programme. First of all, what do you make of this new study?
I think it's really interesting, and it just lends weight and starts filling in the jigsaw piece as the puzzle that is long COVID. And to really understand how we can manage it and ultimately how we treat it, we really need to understand the pathological processes behind it.
And this is, obviously you have long COVID. This is some of the most substantive evidence of an association between having COVID and having cognitive issues. Would you say that you have had cognitive issues?
Yeah, and I still do. I mean, you've got me on not my best day, but I have days, last week was one day when I actually really struggled. I didn't actually have any conversations because they felt too much for me. It's very fluctuating, but I got it early on, so it's the first virus right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I'm sort of almost in shock that it's nearly 4 years, and I still haven't been able to return to work as a consultant.
How do you feel about that?
There's been a huge amount of frustration and having to sit out the pandemic, from the sidelines. Whereas an infectious disease consultant, you should have been in the thick of it. But then that's sort of, from that, there's been a level of acceptance, and I've started doing other things and working out what I can do within the confines of the sort of new parameters that I'm having to live by.
What are your symptoms then? How are you affected?
So brain fog is one, and has been a very major one. Post-exertional malaise or fatigue, which is not being tired all the time. You feel really very unwell with it. And I've also had sort of palpitations, so rapid heart rate, and it's all very variable and unpredictable. So no 2 days are necessarily the same.
Dr. Adam Hampshire, people are going to hear about this association between COVID and this loss in IQ points. How significant would you say your study is?
I think it's got a number of aspects that are very important. So first of all, we observe this association between slightly poorer memory and cognitive function and even relatively short duration COVID illness. That's quite a novel finding. We were a bit surprised by it. On the other hand, what's more positive is we can see that association attenuated, it reduced over time through the pandemic as we got on towards the more recent variants. So there's a positive side there as well. And perhaps in terms of long COVID, where we looked at people who had sort of longer term persistent symptoms, whilst we see more pronounced memory and planning and cognitive problems in those participants, the people whose symptoms had eventually resolved, those individuals actually perform at the same level as people who had short duration symptoms. So there are some quite promising findings in there as well.
Okay, so, sorry, go
I
on.
was going to say that comment does give me hope, because we don't know, you know, I do feel I'm on the path of recovery, and I'm certainly much better than I was a few months ago, and I look back, not week on week, but I look back month on month and see how I've done. But to actually hear positive news like that is really helpful and sort of inspiring and vital, because, you know, you don't want to be in brain fog for the rest of your life when you used to be able to think quite well.
Yeah. Can I just ask you about the term brain fog? Because it feels like an inferior phrase for what you're experiencing and for what you have found in your study. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's like long COVID became a phrase that the sort of public and those with long COVID coined. So it's post-acute COVID syndrome. And brain fog, I suppose, for most people encompasses, you know, it is basically like your brain is in a sort of fog where you can't think clearly. Your memory can be poor, you know, reading an article can be too much, having a conversation can be too much, you know, even writing an email can be too much. And then, you know, it's like the fog, it clears, and then, you know, a few hours later or the next day, you wake up and you can give an interview or do something else.
Yeah. Do you think this is unique to COVID in terms of the cognitive impairment?
I don't think it's unique to COVID, but it's probably more common, perhaps more pronounced. That said, our study can't really address that question because what we didn't do is look at other respiratory illnesses.
Okay. Joanna, as a society, I just want to ask you finally, what adjustments do you think we need to make, if any, to make sure that people like you can live and work in a fulfilled and meaningful way?
I think there needs to be much more support. So help for people with long COVID remains a postcode lottery. So clinics, there are clinics all over the country, probably about 80 currently, maybe more clinics, but access to those is really variable. So for example, I'm based in southwest London, my help has been diabolical because there isn't a good clinic that has something. Whereas if you're based in some parts of northwest London, the help is excellent. So you need support, you need you know, occupational health support to help people get back to work. And you need to continue to have funding put in both to clinics and both to research. And that research then needs to translate into care and management, and hopefully, you know, for drugs to know what to target, but also for non-pharmaceutical interventions that have been proven to have benefit. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you both very much for coming in. Thank you. Continued success with your recovery as well. Thank you.